If you happen to have been watching the pre-recorded morning prayer services that we broadcast on YouTube and Facebook at 9:30 lately, you may have noticed that we've been having a little bit of fun playing with a green screen. With it, we've been able to put Jessica on a boat fishing right there in the chancel. We've been able to throw her out in space. I threatened to keep her there, but didn't take. We've been able to bring the weekly readings to life by placing puppets, cloth, finger, or otherwise, in front of the green screen to transport them, to make them characters in the very footsteps of Jesus in the Holy Land. Like this Sunday, when we made Jesus, along with Peter and James and John, appear on Mount Tabor for the Transfiguration. I've had a green screen for years, but it's been little used, as it is more difficult to use than watching the weather report on the news may suggest. You see, the green screen itself has to be perfectly straight, with no spots or wrinkles. And even more importantly, the lighting has to be perfect. See that you don't cast any shadows. The lights have to be set at a very kind of parallel level, and then one light coming from this direction, and it's complex. And even if you get all of that correct, you still have to ensure that the lighting that you're using in the moment somehow matches the background lighting of the image, or else it shows that the lighting is off. Your brain somehow knows that this video is a green screen. Think about any of those car scenes you've seen in a TV movie where the motion's moving behind them and they're sitting talking and not watching the road. You know what I'm talking about. You can tell. It sticks out like a sore thumb. It's just too obvious. It's for this reason that we've used our green screen to humorous effect, hamming it up with puppets and impossible scenarios. As we were shooting this week's gospel story with the green screen in the chapel, I started meditating on the nature of lighting, illumination, and shadow, and how all these elements are really at play in today's gospel story. The story of Jesus taking up a couple of his disciples up a mountain to reveal his inner nature is a deeply mysterious and moving story, one that we're, quite honestly, not sure what to do with. What the hell do you do with a story about somebody shining in this kind of way? I mean, if I were Peter or James or John and had witnessed what the church has now called the Transfiguration, I'd spend the rest of my life pondering exactly what it meant. And I'd not only wonder what I'd seen, but why I'd seen it. Now, most biblical scholars conjecture that this amazing story of the Transfiguration is really a misplaced story of one of Christ's resurrection appearances, namely that it's a memory that's out of sequence. I'm sure that doesn't happen to any of you out there. While there might be some truth to it, I have no opinion about whether or not that's true or not. The thing that has always caught my attention, however, about this story is Peter's response. Good old Peter, right? Rabbi, it's good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you and one for Moses and one for Elijah. And then the narrator tells us he said this because he didn't know what to say, because they were terrified. Yes, they were terrified. This was no green screen experience. They knew there was no sleight of hand happening in this moment. Their eyes were seeing what was happening, but I have to wonder if their brains were rejecting what they were seeing. The vision that they were experiencing, you see, doesn't really fit in our natural world, the world that they lived in, the world that we live in. Light doesn't illumine in this fashion. In our natural world, light almost never radiates from within, unless you start a fire, I guess. But rather, light illumines the subject from another vantage point, kind of like the spotlights are illuminating the altar up here, right? No, in the natural world, it's the sun that lights up the world, as the psalmist says today, from the rising of the sun to its setting. Even though we may have discovered electricity and created a world of constant buzzing light, we humans evolved in this natural context and have adapted ourselves to the play of light and darkness. And it leaves a deep impression in the contours of our psyche. As we ourselves conform to that ancient kinship of light and dark, White light always shapes the darkest shadows. As the poet John O'Donohue writes, indeed, the shadow itself is the child of the threshold where black and white converge. There could be no shadow without the light. Conversely, I think the human mind can scarcely imagine the light without a shadow, without shade from its blinding presence. While we all fear the dark and its silent unknown, which I think stands in for death, I think we also fear the brightness of the light, which threatens to unveil us, reveal us, to make us naked. Why else did Adam and Eve hide themselves in the garden and cover them up with fig leaves? So the human experience, the human soul, I think, is a constant dance of coming into the light and hiding in the shadows. You don't have to read the entire works of psychoanalyst Carl Jung to know that that's true. You only have to look into your own heart to know the experience of the shadow side of yourself that you can never quite grasp, never exactly know. And yet, as Jung writes, and as you yourself know, we can't ignore the shadow at all. Ignoring the shadow creates different problems. You remember the childhood tale of a different Peter Pan, who battles with his shadow and is deeply unsettled when it's no longer attached? The boy who never grows up, never grows old, who never seems to face death, can't bear it when his shadow takes flight. There's something about the integration of shadow and light that is endemic to the human experience. All this calls us back to our Peter in the gospel, who speaks out brashly. "Rabbi, it's good for us to be here. Let's make 3 dwellings." Yes, our Peter, who speaks boldly, even when he's really terrified, and himself hiding in the shadows. Yes, I think the emotions that Peter embodies are precisely what this story of light, is all about, and why all 4 gospel writers make mention of it. They are trying to make sense of it, the human response to an encounter with the uncontrollable other world of the divine, a world that illumines so brightly. And while this story may call our attention to the radiance of Jesus' special nature and speak of God's inbreaking reality, it is the human response to it that gives us the attraction to appreciate it, to struggle with it. It is Peter's offer to build 3 dwellings that breaks the spell. Have you ever wondered what this business about dwellings or tents, as some other translations put it, is all about? On the historical and cultural level, Peter's suggestion to build a series of tents or dwellings or booths for each of the transfigured luminaries is actually a Jewish custom and a ritual practice that continues to this day. It was the most important feast in the ancient world, called Sukkot. Literally, Sukkot is the plural of sukkah, booth or tabernacle, which is a walled structure covered with plant material such as palm leaves. And a sukkah is the name of the temporary dwelling in which farmers would live during the harvesting season out in the fields. A fact also connecting to the agricultural significance of the holiday stressed by the book of Exodus. As stated in Leviticus, it is also intended as a reminiscence of the type of fragile dwellings in which the Israelites dwelled during their 40 years of travel in the desert of the Exodus from slavery in Egypt. Throughout the holiday, meals are eaten inside the sukkah, outside, and many people sleep out there. It's an 8-day festival that is bookended by 2 Sabbath holidays, where work is prohibited. I remember seeing these structures in my neighborhood when I lived in Brooklyn, where Jewish families would camp out on their patios or their porches or sometimes the roofs of their apartment buildings under the starless city blinded nights. Like perhaps all festivals, it is a means of bending time, spatializing time, sanctifying it. And I think this is perhaps what Peter's gesture is all about, adapting an ancient cultural practice to make sense of what he's seeing. Peter is offering to set up this moment apart, to literally create a shrine to commemorate it, just like we do when we make videos, whether with green screen or not. But that doesn't seem to be the whole of the story, or to fully address the terror that he's feeling. And I have to wonder if Peter isn't offering to create a shelter to protect himself from the brightness of this transfiguration, to find some shade or shadow of relief from that constant presence of God's radiance. If you've been around the sun on a hot day, especially in the Middle East, I think, you can realize just how unremittent that heat and light are. You just gotta find shelter. Recently, I've read 2 different books by 2 different Irish authors who've both referenced the same ancient Irish proverb in the Irish tongue. They have a saying that goes like this: people live in one another's shadow. People live in one another's shadow. That's deeply poetic, as the Irish are. We could hear it in 2 ways, as both a blessing and perhaps as a threat. Except that in the Irish language, there are 2 words for shadow. The one used in this proverb has positive connotations, and it means shelter. I love that we find shelter, we find comfort, we find meaning and relief in the shadow of those who shelter us, those who love us, our parents, our spouses, our children, our friends, those in our lives. People live in one another's shadow. Perhaps that's what Peter is searching for. You see, this brightness of Jesus' revelatory transfiguration is just too much. Peter doesn't recognize Jesus. Peter's looking for the shelter he's accustomed to, the shadow cast from his friend, his teacher, his beloved rabbi. And all he can find is the unremittent, glorious brightness of light. There's no place for his soul to find rest. There's nothing human about this moment. And so he wants to retreat. This kind of revelation wasn't meant for human consumption. It's perhaps obvious enough, as the text tells us, he led them up a high mountain by themselves. But this is one of those rarefied, numinous mountaintop experiences. One of those encounters with the divine that threaten to undo our very being, while simultaneously also promising a blessing, a freedom that is unbound by time or place. And I think that Peter's attempt to build a shelter is a struggle to find a way to honor both sides of that experience. Also trying to find a way to bring it back down the mountain or to ground it in some sort of human reality. A way of transfiguring the mundane and the ordinary of life by illuminating God's hidden, invisible presence in the midst of our normal life. This is something I think we desperately need in the current moment. This pandemic has altered time in strange ways for us, with some days dragging on in indeterminate uncertainty, wondering when we'll find our turn to get the vaccine, wondering when life can come back to normal, whatever that is. And we find ourselves in a different modern-day proverb, like a Groundhog's Day. And like Puxatawny Phil, we've been forced to encounter our many shadows, including the long shadow cast by racism and white supremacy. We cannot deny or escape our shadows any longer. We have to live with them. We have to embrace them. We have to embrace the light and the dark and realize that's where humans find their space, their place of being. And yet, as we continue to wrestle with our many shadows, I invite you to find comfort and shelter in Jesus, the truly human one that we follow. the one overshadowed, as it said in today's text, by a cloud. May we find relief in that same shadow of God's loving embrace that first embraces Jesus as a son, and then in the shelter of his own belovedness, we find that we too are one with the beloved. Let the glimmer of Christ's brightness be a guiding star to you as we walk these dark paths. And may we all enter into that glory one day. But in the meantime, I pray that God will use you and use your life that's a mixture of shadow and light, as a green screen, that God may continue to show God's saving work in the world. May God's glory be known in you this season. Amen.